The plains of Nebraska stretch flat and silent in the gray light before dawn, 1,000 acres of ground that does not forgive the unprepared and does not reward the timid. A single wagon moves south along a dirt road, no hurry, no hesitation. The woman holding the reins sits straight, her canvas coat the color of old wheat, her eyes the pale gray of a sky that has not yet decided whether it intends to storm. Behind her, 400 pounds of something no one in Creswell County wanted. At the auction grounds, 200 people will one day go completely silent. A bank draft will change hands. Men who came to win will leave without understanding what happened to them. She has been building something for 20 years, in a shed, with free cucumbers and a ledger that knows what happened. Nobody asked her what she was doing. That was their first mistake. Now sit back because this is her story. The wagon came through Dunbar before most of the town had lit its morning fires. It moved south down the main road at a pace that suggested purpose rather than hurry, the two draft horses stepping steady on the packed dirt, their breath rising in small clouds in the early July air. The woman holding the reins sat straight in the bench seat the way a person sits, when they have been sitting that way their whole life and no longer think about it. She wore a canvas work coat the color of old wheat, the left breast bearing a faded patch from the Creswell County Agricultural Cooperative that had been stitched there sometime in the previous decade. Her hair was the dark brown of creek water in autumn, pinned back with the practical efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that hair was not a problem requiring daily reconsideration. Behind her, in the bed of the wagon, rode 400 pounds of the ugliest cucumbers in Creswell County, Nebraska. They were curved like fish hooks and fat as a man's fist, and scarred in the particular way that growing things get scarred when the season has been harder than expected. Some were the pale yellow of things that have stayed on the vine 3 days past their prime. Others had gone to seed inside, their flesh still firm but their centers beginning to soften toward the inevitable. Not one of them would have passed the grading line at the Dunbar Brine and Preserve Works, which ran its cucumbers through a sorting apparatus that rejected anything unable to lie flat and straight in a standard packing jar. The machine did not care about flavor. It cared about geometry. Rowena Fitch knew this because she had asked. She had walked into the Dunbar Brine and Preserve Works on a Wednesday morning in March of that year, 1882, and she had found Lester Grabb in his office behind the main floor, a man of 50-some years who wore his authority the way a barn wears old paint visibly, and with a certain amount of peeling at the edges. She had explained what she wanted. Not asked, exactly. Explained. She told him she was interested in taking the summer culls off his hands, rather than having his men dump them at the road edge, where they created a smell and an inconvenience for everyone within a quarter-mile. She told him she would arrange her own transport. She told him she would need them by the first week of July. Grabb had looked at her across his desk for a moment with the expression of a man who is trying to determine whether he is being asked something sensible. "You want the rejects," he said finally. "Not a question, exactly. I want whatever comes off the grading line that you can't use," Rowena said. "I'll take all of it." Grabb said he didn't see why not. He said he'd have his loading man put them aside rather than hauling them out. He asked if she needed them delivered. She said she would come herself. She thanked him and left, without explaining what she intended to do with 400 pounds of cucumbers that a commercial operation had formally declared useless. And because she did not explain, the explanation was supplied by everyone else in Creswell County, each version a little more confused than the last. Traveling the way information travels in a small Nebraska town in 1882 from the loading floor to the break room, from the break room to the lunch counter at the Dunbar Hotel on Meridian Street, from the hotel to the feed supplier on Railroad Avenue, and from the feed supplier to the steps of the Methodist Church on Sunday morning, where it arrived in a form that bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. By the second week of July, most of Creswell County had heard that Rowena Fitch was hauling home reject cucumbers by the wagon load. The question people asked each other at the grain elevator in the dry goods store and in the churchyard after the benediction was the same question, stated in different registers of bewilderment. What in the world was she going to do with them? Nobody asked Rowena directly. She was not the kind of woman people asked directly. She had her father's eyes, which were the pale gray of a sky that has not yet decided whether it intends to storm, and they had a quality of attention that made a casual question feel like an interruption of something more important. She moved through Dunbar with the unhurried confidence of a person who knows what she is doing and does not require the town's opinion of it. To understand what she was doing with those cucumbers, you have to understand who Rowena Fitch was, where she came from, and what she believed about the relationship between a woman and her land. Because what she was building in the summer of 1882 was not a product. It was a proof, and a proof only makes sense if you understand the theorem it is meant to demonstrate. Rowena Fitch was born in 1851 on 160 acres of Nebraska ground that her father, Silas Fitch, had purchased in 1858 for $2.50 an acre, paying in full from money he had saved across 7 years of hiring himself out to farms in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Silas Fitch was not a man who had been given things. He was a man who had decided, at an early age, that the only reliable arrangement between a person and the world was one in which the person owned outright whatever they required to live. Debt, in Silas's understanding, was not merely a financial condition. It was a transfer of authority. When you owed a man money, that man held a portion of your future in his hand. And a future held in another man's hand was a future that could be shaped by his decisions rather than yours. He had written his philosophy down once, in the winter of 1865, on a piece of pine board that he had sanded smooth with a piece of river stone and then lettered in black paint with a brush made from horsetail hair. The board hung on the wall above his workbench in the shed behind the farmhouse, and it said, "What you own cannot be taken, what you owe can." He did not preach this, he did not discuss it at the dinner table, or use it as the subject of instruction. He simply lived by it every day, in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Rowena paid attention. She was the middle of 60 children, and the only one who stayed when the others left for towns with more promise and fewer winters. Her older brother went to Omaha in 1872. Her younger sister married a railroad man and followed him west to Wyoming. Rowena stayed, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had somewhere to be. The 160 acres and the shed and the workbench and the pine board above it were already, in some way she could not have articulated at 21, hers not legally, not yet, but in the way that things become yours when you have watched them long enough and understood them deeply enough that you cannot imagine them existing without you. Silas Fitch died in the winter of 1876 in his sleep, at the age of 63. He left Rowena the land, the tools, the shed, a small herd of hogs on the south end of the property, a kitchen garden she had been tending for 6 years, and a savings account at Creswell County Savings Bank that held $2,840. Her brothers offered to help her manage the farm. She thanked them and said she would call if she needed anything. She did not call. By the spring of 1882, she was farming the 160 acres alone, running the hog operation, keeping a quarter-acre kitchen garden behind the house, and she had been thinking since the previous October about cucumbers. Not the cucumbers specifically, the question. She had been at the dry goods counter in Dunbar the previous September, waiting for her order of canning lids, when she noticed the shelf of preserved goods along the back wall. Among them was a row of 8-ounce jars of relish from the Dunbar Brine and Preserve Works, their second-grade line, the kind they packed when the first-grade run had leftover product that couldn't meet export specifications. The label was plain paper, the color of old cream, and the price marked in pencil on a card below the shelf was 31 cents per jar. She had picked one up and read the ingredient list: cucumbers, onion, dill, vinegar, salt, sugar, mustard seed, celery seed. She had made better relish than this since she was 14 years old. She set the jar back on the shelf and stood there a moment longer than necessary, turning something over in her mind that wasn't quite a plan, yet just the shape of a plan, the way a question forms before the language arrives to contain it. The women who bought this relish bought it because they were farming and canning and keeping house and raising children, and there was simply no July afternoon with 4 free hours in it. They were not buying it because they preferred it. They were buying it because the alternative was a kind of time they did not have. She did the arithmetic that evening at the kitchen table, on the back of a seed invoice, with a pencil that needed sharpening. 400 pounds of cull cucumbers free, onions from her own garden already planted, dill from the south bed already established for 3 seasons, white vinegar at the cooperative 7 cents a gallon, apple cider vinegar 9 cents a gallon, canning lids and rings 6 cents a dozen, salt, sugar, mustard seed, celery seed, all of it together, less than $3 for a full season's run. The canners were in the shed, paid for. The jars were in the cellar, 320 of them, washed and stacked, inherited from her mother and supplemented over a decade of buying extras at farm sales at 2 cents each. She wrote the total at the bottom of the invoice and looked at it. Then she turned the paper over and started writing a list of what she needed to know before she could proceed. The list had 11 items. By March, she had answered all 11. One of the answers had come from a test she ran in the fall of 1881, before she had settled on anything. She made 8 half-pint jars of relish, 4 with straight white vinegar at full concentration, 4 with an equal mix of white and apple cider vinegar, both at 5% acidity, which she had verified was functionally identical for preservation purposes by writing a letter to the State Agricultural Extension Office and receiving a written reply 6 weeks later. She gave the jars to 4 women she trusted: Agnes Morrow, who farmed the adjacent property, her sister-in-law Beth, the extension agent Vera Hollis, and the pastor's wife at the Methodist Church, a woman named Frances Canby, who had opinions about food the way some people have opinions about scripture. She did not tell any of them which jars were which. All 4 preferred the mixed vinegar. Frances Canby said the straight white version tasted like what she bought at the dry goods store. She was not offering a compliment. Rowena wrote this result in her notebook. Then she worked backward through the cost arithmetic and determined that the apple cider vinegar added 11 cents per full season batch and improved the product by a margin she was prepared to call decisive. She wrote that down too. The notebook was a green cloth-covered ledger, the same style her father had used for his farm accounts, purchased at the stationer's on Meridian Street for 15 cents. She had transferred his final entries into a new book when his filled up, continuing in her own hand, and had kept a second ledger running alongside it since 1877, this one dedicated entirely to the preserved goods work she had been doing in small quantities for years. Every jar, every batch, every cost, every sale. Not because she enjoyed the paperwork, because the ledger doesn't know what I think I remember. She had written on the inside cover, in her father's handwriting style. It knows what happened. She started on the 6th of July, a Saturday, at 4:30 in the morning. The shed behind the house was her father's shed in every physical particular. The concrete floor he had poured himself in the summer of 1869, leveled with a long board and smoothed with a wooden float while Rowena, then 18, held the lantern. The workbench along the north wall was oak plank salvaged from a corn crib that had collapsed in a windstorm in 1871. The boards planed flat and jointed tight, resting on legs he had mortised and pegged because he did not trust nails in structural work. Tin roof popped and settled as the temperature changed. The cast iron Monarch range in the southwest corner, purchased at a farm sale in 1874 for $4.20, was where her father had run the canners in summer, keeping the heat outside the house, and it was where she ran them now, with the shed door open and the small window on the east wall propped with a stick to pull air through. The main canner was a 42-quart pressure canner that had belonged to her mother's family, brought west in a wagon in 1857. Its seams resealed and its pressure gauge tested at the state extension office every April, as her father had tested it every April. The gauge was accurate within 2 pounds per square inch. A gauge that was wrong made every batch a guess. Rowena did not operate by guessing. Agnes Morrow arrived at 5 o'clock with her own apron folded over her arm and her own paring knife in the apron pocket, and no questions. She was a woman of 41 who had been farming alone since her husband Clement died of a fever in 1878, leaving her 110 acres and no debt, which was the best thing Clement Morrow had ever done for his wife, though it had not been intentional. Agnes had the quality that certain prairie women develop over years of working alone, a kind of efficient silence, an ability to assess a task and begin it without ceremony. She looked at the cucumbers stacked in the shed, at the canners on the stove, at the jars stacked on the shelves along the east wall, put on her apron, picked up a cucumber, and started sorting. They sorted in silence for the first hour. The genuinely rotten ones, perhaps 30 pounds of the 400, went to a bucket for the compost. The soft ones with good skins went to a separate pile for processing first. The firm, usable remainder came to 362 pounds, which was better than Rowena had estimated. The grinding came next. Rowena's grandmother's hand-crank grinder was bolted to the end of the workbench, its cast-iron body worn smooth at the handle from decades of use. The blades resharpened the previous fall until they would take a thin slice from a sheet of paper held vertically. The cucumbers went through in rough pieces, emerging as a coarse grind that fell into the 2 largest enamel pots. Agnes fed the grinder. Rowena managed the pots. The rhythm was established within 10 minutes and did not need to be discussed. The ground cucumber went into layers, with pickling salt, a pound of salt to every 10 pounds of cucumber, and the pots were covered with cheesecloth and set aside. This was the step most people skipped when they made relish at home, and it was the reason most home relish was thin and watery on the plate. Rowena's mother had not skipped it. Her recipe card said 3 hours. Rowena looked at the humidity coming in through the open shed door, the July air thick and slow. The sky the white gray of a morning that intended to hold heat all day, and she let the cucumber rest for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The onions came from the kitchen garden, harvested that morning before the grinding began. 40 pounds of them, white and yellow both, ground separately and salted in a smaller enamel pot. The smell in the shed went sharp and eye-watering as the onion paste released its oils, and Agnes stepped outside twice to clear her eyes, which was not weakness but simple physiology, and then came back in. The dill was fresh cut that morning from the south bed, the seed heads just beginning to brown. At the tips, the point at which the essential oils were most concentrated, a fact recorded in her father's notes and transferred to her own notebook in 1877. She stripped the seed heads and the upper stems into a clay bowl and set them near the stove to dry slightly while the cucumber drained. The brine came together in the largest pot: 2 cups of white vinegar, 2 cups of apple cider vinegar, 3/4 cup of sugar, 2 tablespoons of whole mustard seed, 1 tablespoon of celery seed, a half teaspoon of turmeric that turned the brine a yellow, the color of old gold, a pinch of red pepper flake, not enough to make the heat noticeable, just enough to make its absence noticeable in something that didn't have it. She brought it to a full rolling boil and let it run 3 minutes to bloom the spices, then reduced the heat. The cucumbers and onions went in, drained and pressed dry through cheesecloth. The dill went in last. The shed filled with a smell that was sharp and green and sweet in layers, the vinegar's edge cutting through the dill's brightness. the mustard sitting underneath it all like a low note on an organ. Agnes, carrying a tray of rinsed jars through the doorway, stopped in one unguarded moment. "Lord," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Rowena did not respond. She was watching the pot. They filled and sealed and processed through the afternoon. Rowena loaded jars into the canning rack, lowered it into the canner, sealed the lid, brought the pressure up to 10 pounds per square inch as confirmed by the gauge, and ran each batch for 15 minutes. When the pressure dropped and the seal was safe to break, she lifted the jars out with the wire jar lifter. Her father had been in 1871 and set them on a folded feed sack to cool. The pings came as each sealed, the sound of a small vacuum forming. A lid pulled down against the jar rim as the hot contents cooled and contracted. Each ping was confirmation. Rowena counted them silently, keeping a running tally she would transfer to the ledger at the end of the day. Agnes left at 7 in the evening when the light had gone soft and the fireflies were beginning in the grass near the creek. She took 3 jars as her share of the work, which was what had been offered before the day began. She drove her small wagon back toward her own farm without ceremony, the way a woman leaves a place where real work has happened. Rowena was still in the shed at 9:30. She worked by lantern light through the last 2 batches, the shed hotter than it had been at midday because the stove had been running for 14 hours and the heat had nowhere to go in the still July air. She drank water from the pump between batches and ate nothing after noon, not from deprivation but from the particular absorption of someone in the middle of a task that does not tolerate interruption. When the last jar was sealed and the steam cleared, she stood for a moment in the shed doorway with the lantern in her hand, looking at the 281 jars cooling on the workbench and the makeshift tables she had set up from sawhorses and boards. She carried them to the cellar in the morning, 2 trips with a wooden crate, arranged them on the shelves in rows with the labels facing out printed in black ink on cream stock at the Dunbar print shop on Railroad Avenue, 100 of them, $3.50 for the lot. The label was simple: Fitch's Harvest Relish, Dunbar, Nebraska. Below that, in smaller letters made from Nebraska cucumbers. The jars sat in the cellar through the rest of July and into August, while Rowena finished the second cutting of hay and moved the hog operation to the north pasture and repaired 3 sections of the fence line along the east boundary. The relish work had taken 9 days, including preparation and cleanup, and once it was done, the farm did not pause for sentiment. In August, she loaded 12 jars into a wooden crate and drove them to the Creswell County Agricultural Fair, which ran for 4 days on the fairgrounds east of Dunbar. She entered them in the preserved foods competition without fanfare, paid the 10-cent entry fee, and left the jars with the exhibition clerk. She went back on the 3rd day for the judging results. The extension agent Vera Hollis was the one who told her. Vera Hollis was a woman who had been assessing agricultural products in Creswell County for 11 years and had the undemonstrative manner of someone who has seen enough good work to calibrate accurately. She said the relish had won first place in the preserved condiments category. The 3 judges had agreed without significant deliberation. One of them, a woman from the southern part of the county who had been entering the competition for 22 years, had said it was the finest dill relish she had tasted at the fair in 2 decades of attending. Vera Hollis was not given to exaggeration. Rowena accepted the blue ribbon, folded it once, put it in her coat pocket, thanked Vera Hollis, retrieved her crate, and drove home. The ribbon went into the bottom drawer of her father's desk, where she kept the farm's important papers. It was not nothing, but a ribbon was not the proof she was interested in. The proof arrived 6 weeks later in a form she had not specifically anticipated. Calvin Prudo farmed 420 acres on the eastern side of Creswell County, which made him one of the larger landholders in a county where size was one of the primary measurements men used to assess each other. He had been eating Dunbar brine 2nd-grade relish on his summer sausage every June and July for as long as his wife Margaret could remember purchasing it, and he had never once mentioned it or thought about it or considered that it could be otherwise. Margaret Prudo had bought a jar of Fitch's Harvest Relish at the 4-H booth, which was selling preserved goods as a fair fundraiser, and she had put it on the table at supper on a Tuesday evening in late September without comment, having decided for reasons she kept to herself that the most interesting response would come from silence. Calvin put relish on his sausage the way he always did, from long habit, without looking at the jar. He ate. He paused, he looked at his plate. He picked up the jar and read the label, which did not tell him much. He set it back down and ate the rest of his supper without comment, which was his ordinary mode. But when the dishes were being cleared, he asked Margaret where she had gotten it. She told him. He said nothing else that evening. But 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, he drove his wagon out to the Fitch property on the West Road. Calvin Prudo was not a man who made casual visits. He drove somewhere because he had a specific purpose, and his purposes were usually transactional. He got down from the wagon near the shed, where he could hear the sound of metal on metal. He stood at the open door. Rowena was at the workbench with a wrench, tightening the bolt on the grinder mount that had been working loose over the course of the summer. She finished what she was doing, set the wrench on the bench, and turned. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have been working since before they were fully grown. with a gray mustache and the kind of permanent squint that comes from 30 years of looking at the Nebraska horizon in full afternoon light. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, which she noticed because Calvin Prudeau was not a man who typically removed his hat. "That relish you put up," he said. The question lived in the pause after that. She told him, "Cucumbers, onion, dill, vinegar, salt, sugar, spices." He looked at the canners on the stove, at the jars on the shelves, at the workbench and its tools, and at the pine board above the bench that her father had painted in a winter evening in 1865. His eyes stayed on the board a moment longer than they stayed on anything else. "Your father would have understood what you're doing here," he said. The words carried a weight. She recognized the weight of a man who did not offer things like that easily, and knew the difference between understanding and approval. It was not quite either. It was closer to recognition. "He taught me the principle," she said. "I applied it." Calvin Prudeau put his hat back on. He walked back to his wagon and drove east on the road toward his own land, and Rowena watched him go for a moment before turning back to the grinder mount. By the end of September, the story traveling through Creswell County had changed character. It had stopped being the story of a woman hauling garbage home in a wagon and become something else, something harder to categorize, and therefore more interesting to a county that categorized most things quickly. It had become the story of a woman who had figured something out. A farmer telling other farmers about something he has tasted with his own mouth is a different kind of testimony than a farmer laughing at something he doesn't understand. One is opinion. The other is evidence. Creswell County respected evidence when it arrived in a form the evidence giver could directly verify. By the end of October, Rowena had sold 194 jars, some through the 4-H booth, some through word of mouth, the largest portion through a standing arrangement she had worked out in September with Orson Pell, who ran the dry goods and general merchandise store on the north side of Meridian Street. Pell had agreed to carry 12 jars on the counter near the register at 45 cents each. Of that, Rowena received 38 cents per jar. She had walked into his store on a Thursday morning with a sample jar and a price she had already decided on, and she had explained the arrangement she was proposing. Pell opened the jar, smelled it, closed it, and said he'd try 12 and see how it moved. She delivered the 12 jars that same afternoon. All 12 were gone in 11 days. He ordered another 12. She ran the full accounting in the ledger in November. Total cash outlay for the batch, $5.80, not counting the labels, which she counted separately as a startup cost. Total jars produced 281. Total jars sold 194. Total revenue, $73.72. Net return after costs, $37.46 from labor she owned and equipment that was already paid for. $37.46 from cucumbers a commercial operation had thrown away. She opened a separate savings account at Creswell County Savings Bank the following week, separate from the farm account, separate from the hog account, because separate accounts made the ledger truthful in a way that combined accounts did not. She deposited $30 and kept $7.46 in the farm household account for the following season's incidentals. She told the bank clerk, a young man named Fletcher, who was new to the position, that she wanted the account in her name alone and would not require a co-signatory. Fletcher wrote it down without comment. On the drive home, she stopped the wagon at the top of the small rise on the west road where, on a clear day, you could see the full run of the bottom land along the creek, her father's original 160 acres laid out below in the pale November light, the stubble fields and the windbreak of cottonwoods along the south line, and the shed behind the house, with its tin roof catching what was left of the afternoon. She sat there for a moment without any particular sentiment, looking at it. The arithmetic was not the point. The arithmetic was the demonstration. The point was the principle underneath it, the one her father had put into plain language on a pine board and hung above a workbench in a shed that was still standing. She had owned the cucumbers the moment they came off the Dunbar brine grading line, owned them in the sense that mattered, the sense of having been the only person who saw what they actually were, rather than what the commercial system had decided they were. She had owned the jars. She had owned the canner. She had owned the shed. She had owned the labor. The only thing the whole operation had required of her that could not be measured in dollars was 31 years of paying attention. She clicked the reins and the horses moved on. What she did not know, on that November afternoon in 1882, was that the account at Creswell County Savings Bank, 3 pages back in the second drawer of the teller's ledger, entered in neat copperplate under F for Fitch, Rowena had just become the quietest and most consequential thing in Creswell County. She did not know how long she would let it sit before she needed it. She did not know that when she needed it, the need would be sudden and visible in a way that her entire operation had not been, conducted in full daylight in front of a crowd of 200 people who would spend the next 20 years trying to reconcile what they saw with the woman they thought they had known. She drove home in the last of the November light, thinking about whether the south bed could support another half row of dill without crowding the celery. The second summer began the way the first had, with Rowena at the shed before the town was awake, the canners cold on the stove, the ledger open on the workbench to a fresh page dated July 1883. She had ordered 600 pounds of culls this time. Lester Grabb had raised an eyebrow when she came in March to arrange it, not with skepticism exactly, but with the expression of a man recalibrating a number he thought he already knew. He said his loading man would have to set aside more bins. She said that was fine. He looked at her for a moment longer than the transaction required, then wrote it in his ledger, and she thanked him and left. The additional volume required additional jars. She had bought 64 Mason half pints at a farm sale in April at 1.50 cents apiece from the estate of a woman named Vera Greer, who had been putting up preserves since before the war and whose cellar had produced a quantity that her surviving family found both impressive and burdensome. Rowena had driven out to the sale, walked the cellar with a lantern, counted the jars, and offered a flat price for the lot. The family accepted without negotiating. She had also arranged, through a brief conversation with Agnes Morrow in June, that Agnes would come for the first 3 days of production rather than the first 2. Agnes agreed with the same economy of language she brought to everything. 3 days was fine. She would bring extra cheesecloth. On the 6th of July at 4:30 in the morning, Rowena was in the shed with the first fire started under the canner. When she heard the wagon coming up from the direction of Agnes's property, the particular leak of the offside rear wheel that had been wanting grease since spring. Then Agnes was in the doorway with her apron and her knife, and the bundle of cheesecloth under her arm. The first day went well. The sorting, the grinding, the salting, the long drain in the July heat, all of it moved with the efficiency of people who have done a thing before and know where the time goes. Prep for 600 pounds was perhaps a third longer than the prep for 400, not half again as long, which told Rowena something useful about the upper limit before a second stove or a second grinder became necessary. By the end of the second day, they had processed 140 jars. The cellar was beginning to fill. On the morning of the third day, Rowena moved the large canner from its position on the stove to the work table for a cleaning. The pot was heavy, 42 quarts of cast iron and brass fittings, and as she lifted it, the handle on the left side they gave way. Not broke, exactly. Slipped, the bolt working loose from repeated heating and cooling over many seasons, in a way that had been slow enough not to be noticed. Canner tilted. She caught the weight of it against the table edge, which saved it from falling to the concrete floor. But in the catching, the pressure gauge on the lid struck the corner of the workbench. The impact was not dramatic. There was no crack, no visible damage. The gauge's needle still moved freely on its spring. The glass face was intact. She set the canner down, tightened the handle bolt with the adjustable wrench from the rack above the bench, and continued. This was her error, and she knew it later with the particular clarity of errors that could have been avoided by a rule she already knew. The rule was simple: test the gauge against a known standard after any impact, no matter how minor, because a gauge that has been struck may read correctly on casual inspection and incorrectly under pressure. Her father had written this in his notes on the canner, which she kept in the back of the second ledger. She knew the rule. She did not apply it because the gauge looked right. The needle moved freely. The glass was not cracked. There were 140 jars on the cellar shelf and 140 pounds of cucumbers still waiting, and the day was already long. She processed the remaining batches over the following 3 days, working alone after Agnes's third day ended, monitoring the gauge as she always did, watching the needle climb to 10 pounds per square inch and hold, timing the cycles as she always timed them. Everything looked correct. The pings came as the jars cooled. The seals appeared to set. In late July, when the last batch had been down in the cellar for 3 weeks, she brought up a tray of jars for the ledger count. The first lid she pressed with her thumb did not resist. It flexed slightly the way a lid flexes when the vacuum seal beneath it has failed. She pressed 3 more. 2 of them flexed. She stood in the cellar with the lantern and pressed every lid in that section of shelving, moving jar by jar along the row. Of the 180 jars processed after the gauge impact, everyone showed some degree of seal failure. The pattern was unmistakable. The processing temperature had been insufficient. The gauge had been reading high, reporting 10 pounds when the actual pressure was less, and the batches had been processed at a temperature that could not guarantee preservation. She could not sell them. She would not serve them to anyone. The risk was not theoretical. She carried the lantern back up the cellar stairs and set it on the kitchen table and sat down. Outside, the late July morning was beginning to come up through the east window, the sky lightening from black to the deep blue of early dawn. The kitchen was quiet except for the settle of the house and the distant sound of the hogs at the south end moving toward the water trough. She sat for several minutes doing nothing. Then she opened the second ledger and wrote, July 1,883 180 jars lost. Gauge failure after impact on July 8th. Read correctly on inspection but not tested against standard. My error for failing to test after the drop. Do not skip the gauge test, ever, under any circumstances. She wrote it in the same small, unhurried hand she used for cost entries and sales figures. The emphasis was in the fact of writing it at all the only time in the ledger's existence that she had written something addressed to herself rather than to the record. She went back to the cellar and carried the compromised jars out in the wooden crate, 6 at a time, and emptied each one into the compost bucket at the edge of the kitchen garden. The glass jars she rinsed at the pump and stacked on the work table for reuse. The lids, single use, went into the scrap bucket. 180 lids at a half-cent each was 90 cents in metal she could not recover. She wrote that in the ledger, too. What remained on the vines in the late July heat was the tail end of the season. She went through the kitchen garden that afternoon and picked everything still usable, 43 pounds, which was not what she had hoped and was precisely what was there. She adjusted the brine ratio for the smaller volume, extended the drain time, and processed a final 47 jars before the season's cucumbers gave out entirely. 47 jars combined with the 140 from before the gauge impact brought the season's total to 187 usable jars. The previous year she had produced 281. She looked at the number in the ledger for a while. Then she turned to the 1,882 sales page and thought about what 187 jars could cover. The fair order, the Pell counter, the most reliable word-of-mouth customers, it was enough. Not comfortably enough, but enough. She would not be expanding into any new arrangements this year. She wrote this in the ledger not as a lament but as a constraint, which was how constraints functioned when you acknowledged them honestly. The morning after she had finished emptying the failed jars into the compost, Agnes Morrow's wagon came up the road from the east. Rowena was reorganizing the cellar shelf space when she heard the familiar wheel creak. Agnes pulled up, got down, stood for a moment looking at the shed and the reduced rows of jars visible through the open door, and then put on her apron, which she had brought, though there was nothing left to process, and walked out to the kitchen garden. She worked her way down the cucumber row, gathering the last of anything that might have been missed. There was not much. Perhaps 8 pounds of the very end of the season, things Rowena had passed over the day before as too small or too soft. Agnes picked them anyway, brought the bucket to the shed, and set it next to the work table. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Gauge," Rowena said finally, which was the whole explanation, and Agnes nodded once, which was the whole acknowledgement, and then Agnes began rinsing jars at the pump in the same manner she always did, and the morning continued. What Rowena kept was not the loss itself but the rule, now written where she could not misplace it. The gauge had not been tested after the impact, because the morning was long and everything looked correct. Everything looking correct was not the same as everything being correct. These were different conditions, and treating them as equivalent had cost her the better part of a season's production. She did not make that distinction again. The bread and butter pickle chips came in the summer of 1884 from a calculation as simple as the original one. The same cull cucumbers, the same equipment, a different brine sweeter, with a turmeric base that gave the chips a color somewhere between gold and amber when the light came through the jar glass. The recipe was her mother's, found on an index card smudged at the corner where her mother had held it with a wet hand. She ran a test batch of 40 jars in the second week of July, after the relish production was complete, and brought 4 jars to the same 4 women she had used for the vinegar test 2 years earlier: Agnes, her sister-in-law Beth, Vera Hollis, Frances Canby, asking them to evaluate the chips against the Dunbar Brine first-grade chips, which she purchased at Pell's store for 34 cents a jar. She gave them no other instruction. All 4 returned the same verdict within a week. The Fitch chips were distinctly better, firmer, with a snap the commercial product lacked, and a brine that Frances Canby described as having more depth, the sweet-acid balance working in proportion rather than fighting itself. Rowena added the bread and butter chips to the line in the summer of 1884, priced at 47 cents for a pint jar. She processed 83 jars that first season alongside 312 jars of relish, the highest relish volume she had achieved. The gauge had been tested at the extension office in April, calibrated, and returned with a written certification she kept in the back of the second ledger. In the summer of 1886, she added a third product, hot pepper relish, using cayenne and Hungarian wax peppers from the south end of the kitchen garden, surplus from plants she had been growing for her own table for 8 years. A wet June followed by a hot, dry July had produced an unusually heavy set on all the nightshade plants, and the question was simply whether to let the excess go to the compost or run it through the brine. She processed 41 jars and sold them through Pell's store alongside the regular relish, with a handwritten note on the label that said simply, "Pepper relish, hot." The jars were gone in 3 weeks. Pell ordered more for the following season. By the summer of 1886, the counter near the register at Pell's store had 2 running feet of shelf space dedicated to Fitch's products. Orson Pell was a careful man who did not give shelf space to things that didn't move. In the 3 years since the first standing order, the Fitch relish had outsold the Dunbar Brine, second-grade relish, on his counter by a margin that Pell had stopped calculating exactly because the Dunbar Brine product had ceased to appear on his reorder list. Customers had made the choice so consistently that stocking the competitor was no longer a sensible use of the shelf. He told Rowena this in September of 1886, when she came to discuss the following summer's allocation, told her the way a man reports a fact he finds mildly remarkable, not effusively, not with any suggestion that he was doing her a favor by reporting it, just the fact. She wrote it in the ledger that evening as a note beside the sales column, not because the number surprised her, because the ledger was the place where what had actually happened lived, separate from what she thought she remembered, and separate from what anyone might later claim. The savings account at Creswell County Savings Bank had grown by the end of the 1,886 season to $480. The deposits were modest individually, $30 in the first year, 18 in the second because of the gauge loss, 54 in the third, the fourth and fifth years growing as the volume grew and the product line expanded. The sum was not large by the measure of men who ran operations backed by bank credit. It was large by the measure of what it was, money that belonged entirely to her, produced from equipment she owned and raw material that cost her nothing, accumulating with compound interest in an account that no creditor had any claim on. She thought about it the way her father had thought about similar things, which was to say she did not think about it very often. The ledger tracked it. The bank held it. Her job was to continue the work. Delia had first come to the shed in the summer of 1883, the summer of the gauge failure. Though Rowena had not known it at the time because Delia arrived and departed without being seen, which was something 12-year-old girls were capable of when they wanted to be. What Delia saw, through the open shed door on a July afternoon, when Rowena was running a canning cycle alone and concentrating on the gauge, was a woman managing a process with the focused attention of someone solving a problem that had been set out in advance. The canners, the jars, the steam, the timer on the workbench, the notebook open to a page of numbers, all of it had the quality of something organized by a mind that understood what each element was for. Delia was the daughter of Rowena's older brother Thomas, who had moved his family to a farm 12 miles east of Dunbar in 1878. She had her grandfather Silas's pale gray eyes and a habit of stillness that was unusual in a child her age. She appeared at the shed on subsequent summers with increasing regularity, always arriving without announcement and always finding something to do without being assigned it, rinsing jars at the pump, sweeping the grinding chaff off the concrete floor, carrying the full compost bucket to the garden without being asked. Rowena noticed, and said nothing about noticing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. By the summer of 1885, when Delia was 14, she had begun watching the canning cycles with the attention of someone memorizing a sequence rather than observing a spectacle. She had asked one question in 3 summers, which was whether the timing of the processing cycle changed with the size of the jar, and Rowena had answered it directly yes. And here is why. And here is the reference in the Extension Service documentation. And Delia had written this down in a small notebook she had brought without being told to bring one. The notebook was the thing that told Rowena something she had not been certain of before. A girl who brings a notebook to a shed without being instructed to bring one has already made a decision about what kind of person she intends to be. In the spring of 1887, the weather that had been dry the previous autumn turned into something recognizable to anyone who had been farming the Great Plains long enough. March came in warm and stayed warm with no snow, which was the first sign. April brought 15 days of wind out of the southwest with no rain behind it, which was the second sign. By May, the subsoil moisture was beginning to draw down, and the winter wheat in the eastern fields was showing the pale, slightly dulled color of plants working harder than they should have to be working in May. Rowena watched this the way she had learned from her father, to watch weather not with alarm but with attention, tracking what the ground was doing rather than what the sky was doing, because the sky was unreliable and the ground told the truth. The ground told a difficult truth through the summer of 1887. The kitchen garden held up because she watered it from the pump, 2 buckets a morning. The cucumber vines on the south end responded with the stubborn vitality of plants that had been in that bed for 3 seasons and had roots deep enough to find moisture below the surface zone. The culls from the Dunbar brine line were, if anything, more plentiful than usual. A dry year produced more irregular shapes, cucumbers stressed by inconsistent moisture growing unevenly, curved and flattened in ways the grading line couldn't accommodate. Her own operation was not affected by the drought in any direct material way. The culls were still free, the shed was still standing, the canner still worked, the gauge tested and certified in April as always. The water for the brine came from a well that Silas Fitch had dug in 1861 at a depth of 38 feet, deep enough that it had never run dry in the 26 years since. But the farms around her were not similarly insulated. The Dunbar Brine and Preserve Works had borrowed money in 1885 to expand a new pressing room, 2 additional vat lines, a loading dock on the east side of the building. The expansion had been sensible in 1885, when the previous several years had been good ones, and the pickle business was growing on the back of a growing population and railroad access. The bank had loaned them at 8%, which seemed reasonable in 1885. By 1887, the drought had reduced the local cucumber crop significantly enough that the works was buying from suppliers in Missouri to maintain volume, paying freight that had not been in the original cost assumptions. The 8% interest on the expansion loan was not itself ruinous, but it was a fixed outflow in a year when the variable costs had gone up and the margin had gone thin. Lester Grabb did not discuss this with Rowena. She learned of it through the grain elevator, specifically through a conversation she overheard between two men waiting to weigh a wagon of oats. She did not participate. She listened, drove home, and wrote a single line in the margin of the ledger. September 1887 Dunbar brine, carrying freight costs from Missouri cucumbers. Expansion debt at 8%. Watch. That evening, she went through the previous 5 years of cost entries for her own operation and found something that had been sitting in plain sight. She had been buying white vinegar by the case from Pell's wholesale account, saving approximately 2 cents a gallon over buying by the individual jug. She had not extended this logic to the apple cider vinegar, which she had continued to buy by the individual gallon, because the case minimum at wholesale was 20 gallons, and she had not been certain she would use 20 gallons before the vinegar turned. In 5 years, she had used on average 17 gallons per season. She sat with this for a while, then she wrote in the margin, vinegar buying ACV at retail. 5-year average 17-gallon season, case minimum 20 gallons, overpaying 2 cents per gallon 1.70 per year, 850 over 5 years. Switch to wholesale next season, store remaining inventory. She underlined the 5-year total twice, not for drama, but because it was the kind of figure that was easy to misplace and harder to misplace when underlined. $8.50 was not a large sum. It was a sum she had been giving away unnecessarily for 5 years because she had not extended a principle she already knew. The ledger did not care about her reasons. The drought deepened through the winter of 1887 into 1888. Across Creswell County, farms that had borrowed to expand in the good years of the early 1880s were now managing a combination of reduced production and fixed debt service that had no comfortable resolution. The county bank had extended several loans through the end of 1887 on the expectation of a recovery that did not materialize. The Heller property went to notice in February. Edmund and Constance Heller had farmed 220 acres on the north section of the county for 16 years, good ground, tile-drained, running along the creek bottom where the soil was deep and dark and had been building since before any European settler had put a plow to it. They had borrowed in 1882 to buy an additional 40 acres adjoining their east line. By February of 1888, the loan was 3 months in arrears. Rowena heard about the notice at the cooperative in March, mentioned in the same tone in which the man behind the counter mentioned the price of cottonseed meal. She drove home and sat with her savings ledger for an evening. The account stood at $960 at the end of the 1887 season. She did not move any money. She made no decisions that evening. She wrote the date in the margin and beside it wrote, Heller property 220 acres north section. Watch the notice. The auction was announced in the county paper for the last Saturday of April, 1888. Rowena read the notice, noted the acreage, the soil description, the location. She knew the creek bottom on the north section. She had been past it many times on the road to the grain elevator, and she had noticed it the way a person notices good ground when they have grown up understanding what good ground looks like. Her father had mentioned it once when she was 16 and they were driving past it in the spring, the creek up from snowmelt and the bottom land still soft. He had said only, creek bottom holds moisture. Dry years are survived on creek bottom. The auction was on a Saturday. She arranged for a neighbor to check the hogs. She put on the canvas coat and drove the wagon to the fairgrounds east of town, where auctions of this kind were held when the crowd was expected to be large enough to need the space. The crowd was large. The land speculators from Omaha had come down for 3 previous Creswell County auctions in the past year, arriving in the manner of men who have done a thing several times and know how it goes, confident, positioned near the auctioneer's stand, talking to each other in the private shorthand of people who share a financial interest. There were also 2 men from Lincoln she did not recognize, well-dressed in the careful way of investors who want to be taken seriously without appearing ostentatious. Rowena stood at the back of the crowd. She had done her accounting at the kitchen table the previous evening, working through the savings ledger with a pencil and verifying the current balance against the last bank statement. She had determined a number and written it at the bottom of a clean page and then gone to bed. The bidding opened at $3 an acre. The Omaha men went to $3.50 quickly, the practiced ease of people setting a floor they intend to control. One of the Lincoln men bid 4, Rowena bid 4 1/4. The Lincoln man looked in the direction of her voice, a woman in a canvas work coat at the back of the auction crowd, with the specific expression of a man confronting information that does not fit his prior organization of the situation. He bid $4.50, she bid 5. He considered, then he bid $5.25, she bid $5.50. The auctioneer, Bert Callister, read the room and kept his voice at its professional neutral. The Omaha men had dropped out at $5. The Lincoln man looked at the woman at the back of the crowd for several seconds, then looked at his boots, then did not counter. 220 acres at $5.50 per acre. $1,210. She presented the bank draft at the settlement table, writing it from the savings account in the small, precise handwriting she had used in ledgers since she was old enough to hold a pen without pressing too hard. The draft amount matched the number she had written at the bottom of the clean page the evening before to within 10 cents. Calvin Prudo had been near the front of the crowd. He had not bid. He had watched the bidding with the stillness of a man who has no stake in the outcome, but is paying careful attention to what the outcome reveals. When the gavel came down and the settlement was finished, he made his way through the dispersing crowd toward the back, where Rowena was folding her receipt into the inside pocket of the canvas coat. He stood in front of her. He took his hat off and held it in both hands, the same gesture she had seen 6 years ago, in her shed doorway. "Your father knew what ground was worth," he said. "Looks like you do too." The words were a statement of observed fact from a man who measured carefully and reported accurately, which made them worth considerably more than a social compliment. "He taught me what to look for," she said. The creek bottom told the rest. Prudo put his hat back on and moved the door, and the crowd moved with him, and in a few minutes the fairgrounds building was nearly empty. She drove home on the North Road, past the Heller property, her property now, though it would take some time for that word to settle correctly. The gate was closed, the house shuttered, the fields running to the volunteer grass that comes in fast when cultivation stops. The creek was visible through the willow scrub at the bottom of the low ground, still running in late April from the snowmelt, the water brown and cold and moving with purpose. The soil along its edge was the color of dark coffee. Creek bottom holds moisture. Dry years are survived on creek bottom. She did not stop the wagon. She drove home, unhitched the horses, fed them, checked the hogs, and went to the shed. She opened the savings ledger to the current page and wrote the date in the transaction: 220 acres north section, 5. 50 acre, 1,210, bank draft April 28, 1,888. Then the new balance. The number was smaller than it had been for several years. That was correct. That was what money was for. The following morning, a Sunday, Delia appeared at the shed in the middle of the morning, riding 12 miles from her father's farm without being sent for. She was 17 years old. She tied the horse at the fence rail and walked to the shed door and stood there looking at the jars remaining from the 1,887 season, at the canners on the stove, at the workbench with its tools and ledgers and the pine board above it. Then she looked at Rowena, who was working on the canner handle bolt again, tightening it against further loosening, a seasonal task now. The girl pulled her notebook from her coat pocket and held it, and said the thing she had clearly been working up to for the better part of the ride out. "Would you teach me to read the ledger? Not just the numbers the way it's built." Rowena set the wrench down. She looked at the girl, at the gray eyes that were Silas Fitch's eyes, at the notebook visible in her hand, at the expression of someone who has been working up to a question for long enough that the question has acquired more weight than it strictly requires. She went to the drop front desk in the corner of the shed, opened the second drawer, and took out the spare green cloth ledger she had purchased the previous autumn against the day when the current one filled up. She brought it to the workbench and set it in front of Delia. "Sit down," she said. Outside, the April light was coming in low through the east window, throwing a long rectangle across the workbench, crossing the new ledger's cover, touching the edge of the pine board above. The board's lettering was fading now, the black paint that had been dense in 1,865 going thin at the strokes where the weather had gotten into the wood, but the words were still there, still readable to anyone who stood close enough and looked. "What you own cannot be taken. What you owe can." Rowena opened to the first page and began to explain how the ledger worked, not what it said, but what it was for, which was a different explanation and the more important one. The lesson lasted 3 hours that first Sunday. By the end of it, Delia had filled 11 pages of the new green cloth notebook with entries copied from the original, not copied to copy them, but copied to understand the structure, the way a person traces a map to learn the country rather than to reproduce the map. Rowena showed her the column system: date, batch description, input costs itemized by ingredient and source, output count, sale price by channel, revenue net. Each row a complete accounting of a single transaction or batch, each page a month, each season a story told in numbers that did not editorialize. The ledger did not say the 1,883 season had been difficult. It said 180 jars lost, gauge failure, 94 jars salvaged, net 18, 40 lowest season in 3 years. The difficulty lived in the numbers and nowhere else, which was what made the numbers trustworthy. Delia asked questions that went to structure rather than detail. Not what does this number mean, but why is this category separated from that one? Why does the gauge maintenance cost appear in the capital column rather than the operating column? What is the difference between a cost that recurs and a cost that is a one-time investment? These were not the questions of a person learning bookkeeping. They were the questions of a person learning to think about an operation as a system. Summer came in fast and dry in 1,889, the second consecutive dry year on the Great Plains, though the well held and the kitchen garden survived on the morning watering. In May, before the cucumber season began, Lester Grab came to the farm. She had not been expecting him. He came on a Tuesday afternoon alone, in a small buggy, rather than the works wagon, the kind of distinction that told her something before he opened his mouth. He was thinner than she had seen him at the works in March, and the particular thinness that comes from a long winter of poor sleep had taken the color from him. He held his hat at his side. He told her the works was closing. Not struggling, not restructuring, closing. The bank had called the expansion loan in March, citing 2 seasons of reduced local cucumber supply and the freight costs from Missouri imports that had eaten through the operating margin. The equipment would be auctioned in June. He said he thought she should know because it affected her supply arrangement. The culls would stop when the work stopped. She thanked him for coming to tell her directly. He looked at the shed for a moment, at the canners, at the ledger on the workbench, at the jars on the shelves. Then he said there was a secondary matter. Among the equipment going to auction was a set of 3 commercial-grade pressure canners, larger than anything she was currently running, with gauges that had been calibrated by the manufacturer 2 seasons ago and kept in good condition. The auction house from Omaha running the sale wouldn't know what they were worth to someone who knew how to use them, and the bidding would likely start low. She wrote the auction date in the margin of the ledger that evening, with the estimated starting prices beside it, looked at the savings account balance, and determined the numbers were compatible. She would need to examine the gauges before bidding. These were determinable facts. At the works auction in June, she arrived early enough to examine the canners before the bidding crowd gathered. She brought her own gauge testing standard, a sealed reference vessel borrowed from the extension office, carried wrapped in cloth in the wagon bed, and tested each of the 3 canners' gauges against it in the loading dock while the auction house men were still setting up tables. All 3 were accurate within acceptable range. The sealing surfaces were sound. The largest had twice the capacity of her existing canner. She bid on all 3 and took all 3 for a combined total of $12, which was less than the cost of one new commercial canner from a manufacturer's catalog. The auction house men from Omaha had not known what they were worth to someone who knew how to use them, which was exactly what Grab had said would happen. Canners came home, padded with feed sacks, and went onto the stove in the shed where they fit with room to spare, because Silas Fitch had built the stove platform long enough for 3 units when he'd installed it in 1869, on the reasoning that if one was useful, more would be more useful, and the platform cost the same to build long as short. Delia was there when they arrived. She had come that morning expecting the usual summer production work, and instead she helped unload the canners and clean the interiors with a vinegar wash and test the pressure valves on each one before they were set in position. She went through this process with the focused attention she brought to mechanical things, asking questions that confirmed she understood not just the what but the why the valve was designed with a weighted rather than spring mechanism, why the sealing surface needed vinegar rather than soap, why the gauge was tested before every use rather than every season. Rowena answered each question directly and completely, on the reasonable assumption that a person who asks a precise question can receive a precise answer. In July, when the summer's cucumber supply came entirely from her own kitchen garden, the 3 new canners changed the rhythm of production. She could run 2 canners simultaneously on the expanded stove platform, cutting the processing time for a full batch by roughly a third. She wrote these observations in the ledger as operating notes, projecting their effect on the following season's capacity. With the new canners and the 2 acres she was planning on the creek bottom land for the following spring ground that had the moisture retention to support cucumbers in a dry year, the projection went to 450 jars, possibly 500. In the fall of 1889, she wrote a letter. It went to the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad's Regional Freight and Supply Office in Omaha, addressed to the Supply Procurement Officer, a title she had found in the railroad's published directory at the Dunbar Post Office. The letter introduced Fitch's Harvest Relish, 3 products, available in half-pint and pint jars, produced in Dunbar, Nebraska, from Nebraska-grown cucumbers using traditional methods. She described the product line, the packaging, the available volume for the coming season, and the price per case she was prepared to offer at wholesale. She stated clearly that she was not represented by any broker and was making direct contact because she was interested in a direct arrangement. She sent the letter by registered post in November. An acknowledgement card came in December. A reply letter came in January of 1890 from a man named P.H. Aldrich, Supply Procurement, who had forwarded her inquiry to the Depot Supply Purchasing Office in McCook, Nebraska, which handled provisioning for the western Nebraska line. A follow-on letter came from McCook in February from a woman named Louise Crandall, who identified herself as the Depot Supplies Manager, asking for product samples and a price schedule. Rowena sent 6 sample jars, 2 of each product in a wooden crate padded with straw, with a handwritten price schedule and a note specifying minimum order quantities and delivery lead times. Louise Crandall replied in 3 weeks. The dill relish was excellent. The bread and butter chips were very good. The pepper relish had raised some debate, but was unanimously approved by the subset of the staff who liked heat, which she described as the majority. She asked whether Fitch's harvest products could be available for the spring supply order beginning in May 1890. Rowena wrote back and said yes. Agnes Morrow came to the shed in April because Rowena had left a note at her fence post the previous week the way she communicated with Agnes when she had something specific to discuss. The note said, "I have a supply contract. I need more hands from June through August. Are you able to work full-time those months?" Agnes arrived with her own notebook, which she had begun keeping in 1887. Its entries more operational than analytical, daily task lists, timing notes, observations about which cucumber varieties came through the grinder cleanly. She sat down at the workbench and looked at the contract terms Rowena had laid out on a clean page. "What are you paying?" Agnes said, her voice carrying the flat directness of a woman who had learned that indirect questions cost time she didn't have. Rowena told her, a daily wage in cash, paid at the end of each week, at the rate she had calculated against the per-jar margin on the contract volume. She had shown her work in the margin of the ledger page, the calculation transparent to anyone who read it. Agnes looked at the number in the margin notes. "You've been paying me in jars for 7 years. The jars were what I had," Rowena said. "Now I have something else." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the pencil from the workbench and wrote her initials at the bottom of the page, which was not a legal contract, but was an Agnes Morrow contract, which in Rowena's experience was more reliable. The first railroad depot order shipped in May of 1,893 jars in wooden crates, delivered to the Burlington Freight Depot in Dunbar for transport west. Rowena stood at the loading dock while the crates went onto the freight wagon, watching the checker count them against the invoice. She did not watch for sentiment. She watched because she had not shipped freight before, and she wanted to understand the process, where the vulnerabilities were, what she had not accounted for. There were 2 gaps. The invoice required a sender's mark on each crate that she had not been told about, and the stenciling took 20 additional minutes. She wrote this in her notebook and adjusted her crate preparation process accordingly. The second order, in July, went without delay. The creek bottom land on the north section produced its first full cucumber crop in 1890, and in a way that verified everything her father had said. The 1890 growing season was the 3rd dry year in sequence, and the kitchen garden cucumbers on the south end needed daily watering to hold. The creek bottom cucumbers, 2 acres of them, needed watering twice in the entire season. The vines ran heavy and dark green down the rows, while roadside fields in the rest of the county showed the pale working color of plants in stress. She made note of this in the operating log with the specific dates and moisture observations, because it was data about the ground that would be useful in every subsequent dry year, and dry years on the Great Plains were not anomalies. They were a feature of the climate that arrived on no fixed schedule, but arrived regularly enough that any farmer who planned as if they would not occur was planning for a fiction. Delia worked the production summers of 1,889, 1,890, and 1,891 alongside Agnes, learning the railroad contract fulfillment process alongside Rowena. By her 3rd summer, she could run the canning cycles without supervision, monitoring the gauges, timing the processing, managing the cooling and seal checking, with the systematic attention Rowena had been applying for 20 years. She made 1 error in 3 summers, a timing mistake on a late batch on a long day, running a cycle 3 minutes short because she had lost track of when she'd started it. She caught the error herself when she checked the log against the clock and told Rowena before Rowena could notice on her own. Rowena added a rule to the canning protocol, starting time to be written in the log at the moment the cycle begins, not estimated afterward. Delia wrote this in her own notebook without being asked. What Rowena noticed across those summers was not Delia's technical competence, though the competence was real and growing. It was something more fundamental, a quality of attention that did not waver under fatigue or heat, or the numbing repetition of long production days. On the 12th hour of a July afternoon, when the shed was running at a temperature that made the metal of the workbench hot to the touch, Delia worked with the same focus she brought at 6 in the morning. She did not cut corners. She did not rush the steps that resisted rushing. She checked what needed checking even when the checking was tedious. This was either native or it had been absorbed through so many summers of watching someone else work that it had become indistinguishable from native. Either origin was fine. What mattered was that it was present. She had also hired a second woman in 1892 to help with the expanded summer production, a widow from the north side of town named Grace Alderton, whose husband had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her with a working knowledge of kitchen canning and an immediate need for income. Grace was competent, dependable in the specific way that people who need the work are dependable, and she learned the production protocol quickly enough that by the 2nd summer she required minimal direction. Rowena paid her the same daily rate as Agnes, cash at the end of each week, and she had shown this calculation to both women in the first season not because it was customary to do so, but because people work more carefully when they understand the system they are working within. The railroad contract renewed in 1891 and again in 1000. 892, each renewal adding modest volume. The McCook Depot expanded its standing order, and 2 additional depots along the western Nebraska line added Fitch's products to their supply lists through Louise Crandall's purchasing network. By 1,893, Rowena was shipping to 4 depot locations, which required a shift in her production calendar: the June batch to the 2 eastern depots, the July batch to McCook and the new Colby, Kansas location, the August batch as reserve and Pell store allocation. By 1,895, she was producing 4,000 jars in a season. She wrote this number at the top of the year's production page and looked at it for a moment before continuing with the column entries. 4,000 jars from 6 acres of cucumbers she grew herself, processed in a shed her father had built in 1,861, using equipment she owned outright. With 3 women she paid in cash from a margin that had remained positive in every single season since 1,882, including the season of the gauge failure, including the drought years, including every year when everyone around her was managing debt against falling prices. The savings account, which she had stopped thinking of as the Relish account because it had long since become something larger, stood at $3,400 at the end of the 1,895 season. She did not tell anyone this number. The ledger knew it. The bank knew it. That was sufficient. In the winter of 1,894, Rowena had sat down with Delia at the kitchen table with the full ledger history, 13 years of entries in the second green cloth book, and gone through it from the beginning. Not the numbers themselves, most of which Delia had seen during the production seasons, but the reasoning behind the structure. Why the capital account was separated from the operating account. Why the gauge maintenance was amortized across 5 seasons rather than expensed in the year it occurred. Why the label cost from 1,882 was recorded as a startup investment rather than a recurring cost. Delia was 23 years old, with the gray Fitch eyes and her grandfather's handwriting, and a notebook already on its 3rd volume. She worked through the entries methodically, asking questions that went deeper than they had in 1,889, informed now by 6 years of production experience. In the 3rd week of their sessions, she stopped on a page from 1,887 and looked at the vinegar line. You were buying the cider vinegar by the gallon. I switched to wholesale cases in 1,888, Rowena said, the entries on the next page. Delia turned the page, looked at the wholesale entry, then back at the 1,887 entry, then at the 5-year column. Rowena had built in the margin the calculation of what the retail versus wholesale difference had cost across 5 seasons. She looked at the number the way you look at a precise fact that is both obvious in retrospect and genuinely surprising in the present. $8.50, she said, over 5 years. Because you were buying 17 gallons a year retail when the case minimum was 20. Because I hadn't extended the wholesale logic far enough, Rowena said. I knew the principle. I didn't apply it consistently. Delia wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. What would you have done differently if you'd caught it in year 2 instead of year 5? It was the right question, not what the error was, but what the correction protocol should have been. Rowena told her, a quarterly review of every recurring cost line against available alternatives, separate from the season-end accounting, not to find the big costs, but to find the small ones that drifted across multiple seasons below the threshold of immediate notice. Delia wrote this down in the same careful hand. That evening, after Delia had ridden back east, Rowena opened the ledger to the current page and wrote, Winter 1,894. Delia found the vinegar error. She was right. And then, below it, in smaller writing, she asked what I would have done differently. Nobody has ever asked me that before. The Granger County Agricultural Society invited her to speak in the spring of 1902. The invitation came in a letter signed by the Society's corresponding secretary, a woman named Helen Pratt, who said the Society was holding its annual conference for farm women at the Creswell County Fairgrounds building in May, and would Rowena be willing to speak about the development of her preserving operation. The letter was gracious and specific, not a vague invitation to share experience, but a request to speak about the particular history of what she had built, which suggested Helen Pratt had done her research. Rowena wrote back and offered 15 minutes. Helen Pratt replied and asked for 30. Rowena offered 20 and received a letter back saying 20 would be fine, which was the negotiation she had expected. She did not prepare remarks in the conventional sense. She prepared by spending an evening with the ledger, going back to the beginning, reading the entries in the order they had been made, the order in which things had actually happened, rather than the order in which they made retrospective sense. She wanted to remember what she had not known at the start, because most of what people said about how they had done things was shaped by knowing how the things had turned out, and the shaping was a kind of dishonesty she had no interest in practicing. The fairgrounds building held about 120 seats, arranged facing a low platform at the south end, where a plain pine podium had been set up. The chairs were nearly full when she arrived. She had not expected this many people. She stood at the podium in the canvas coat, She had not thought about whether to wear it. It was what she wore to work, and this was work. She said the Dunbar Brine and Preserve Works graded cucumbers by shape. A cucumber that was too curved to lie flat in a standard packing jar was a cucumber the works had no use for. I looked at that cucumber and saw relish. The difference between what they saw and what I saw was not intelligence. It was the question. They were asking what they could sell. I was asking what I could make from what was in front of me. Those are not the same question, and they do not lead to the same place. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the first sentence of something says more than expected. She said, I have never borrowed money to run this operation, not because I was afraid of debt, because I did the arithmetic. A jar of relish made from cucumbers that cost nothing, in a shed that was already paid for, with jars that were already paid for, on land that carried no lien. That jar cost me labor and time. I own both of those things. A jar made with a bank loan costs labor, time, interest, and the particular anxiety of knowing that a single bad season can unravel what several good ones built. I preferred the first arrangement. She paused. My father taught me this, not by saying it. He said it once, on a pine board above his workbench, and then he demonstrated it every day for 30 years in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. I paid attention. That is the whole of it. She talked for 19 minutes. She talked about the gauge failure in 1883 without softening at the error, the loss, the rule she had written in the ledger margin and never violated again. She talked about the drought years and what the creek bottom had done and why her father had pointed at it when she was 16. She talked about the savings account and what it had made possible at the Heller auction, stating the number plainly $960 accumulated in the account before she needed it because plain numbers were more useful to a room full of farm women than inspiring vagueness. She talked about Delia, who was sitting in the fourth row with her third notebook open on her knee, and she said that the best thing she had done in 20 years of running the operation was answer the questions of a girl who showed up with a notebook she hadn't been told to bring, because a person who brings a notebook without instruction has already understood the most important thing, which is that what happens is worth recording. Delia did not look up from her notebook when this was said. She wrote something down. Harriet Prudhoe Calvin's widow, a woman of 60-some years who had been attending the Agricultural Society's Women's Conference since its founding, and who had an institutional memory of the county that was both encyclopedic and precise, waited after the room emptied. She moved with the careful pace of someone who has learned that hurrying is not the same as arriving faster. She came to the front and stood before the podium. Calvin talked about you, she said, after the auction in '88. He talked about you for 3 days, which was 3 days more than Calvin talked about most things. Rowena waited. He said he'd watched you work for 6 years and thought he understood what you were doing. Then he stood in that auction crowd and realized he'd understood the method but not the scope of it. Harriet's gaze was steady. He came home and told me, that woman has been building something the whole time we were watching her, and we never thought to ask what it was because we assumed it couldn't be much. The admission was considerable, coming from the widow of a man who had been one of the county's more perceptive judges of agricultural enterprise. Rowena received it in the spirit it was offered, which was honest. Most people assume the most obvious interpretation, she said. A woman hauling cucumbers in July. It's a reasonable interpretation of what they saw. What would you have told them if they'd asked? The question settled in the air of the nearly empty room, and Rowena thought about it the way she thought about ledger entries. She wasn't sure how to categorize holding the question long enough to make sure the answer she gave was the one she actually meant. I would have told them the arithmetic, she said. People understand arithmetic. They mistrust ambition, but they trust numbers. If I had shown them the numbers in 1882, they would have seen what I saw, but no one asked. Harriet Prudhoe nodded once, slowly. No one asks the questions they've already decided they know the answers to. She left, and Rowena stood alone in the fairgrounds building for a moment, looking at the empty chairs. Pine podium with its ring from years of public use. The windows along the west wall letting in the afternoon light at the long angle of a May afternoon. The kind of light that makes everything it touches look slightly more substantial than it does at midday. She thought about the ledger and what it contained and what it did not contain. The numbers were complete: the costs, the batches, the sales, the seasons, the gauge entry, the vinegar margin calculation, the auction draft, the railroad contract terms, the quarterly cost reviews Delia had been running since 1895, which had found 3 other small inefficiencies in the 4 years since, each one recorded and corrected. The ledger was an honest account of what had happened. What it did not contain was what it felt like to sit in a cellar in July of 1883 with a lantern and press the lid of a jar that should have been firm and feel it give. What it did not contain was Agnes Morrow driving up the road the next morning without being called. What it did not contain was Calvin Prudhoe standing at the back of the auction crowd with his hat in his hands, or the particular silence that fell over 200 people when the gavel came down. The ledger was not a record of those things. Those things were recorded somewhere else, in the specific way that real events are recorded, not written down. but deposited permanently in the body of the person who was present for them, available for retrieval without notice, accurate in a way that even the best-kept ledger is not. She walked out of the fairgrounds building into the May afternoon. The wagon was where she had left it, horses patient in the shade of the cottonwood along the fence. She untied the reins, climbed up, and turned the horses south toward Dunbar and the road that ran west to the farm. Delia was waiting at the shed when she arrived, sitting on the bench along the shed's east wall, notebook open, writing something. She looked up when the wagon came through the gate. How did it go? I talked for 19 minutes. What did you talk about? Rowena climbed down from the wagon and handed Delia the reins to tie while she unhitched. The arithmetic, she said, and the gauge, and the creek bottom. And you, Delia tied the horses and came back to the shed door. The afternoon light was coming in low through the west window now, falling across the workbench, across the 3 commercial canners standing in their positions on the stove platform, across the rows of jars from the previous season's batch, still on the shelves waiting for the summer order. It touched the pine board above the bench, the lettering her grandfather had painted in the winter of 1865, faded now to the gray of old charcoal but readable, always readable to anyone who stood in front of it and looked. What did you say about me? Delia said. I said the best thing I did in 20 years was answer your questions. Delia considered this. She looked at her notebook, then at the board, then back at Rowena. You answered every question I asked. Nobody told you to do that. Your grandfather answered every question I asked. Nobody told him to either. Delia wrote something in the notebook, writing with the small, unhurried precision that had been Silas Fitch's handwriting and was now hers, the same style crossing 3 generations, across 3 notebooks that sat on the same shelf, above the same workbench in the same shed on the same ground. Outside, the May evening was coming in from the east, the sky going the particular shade of deep blue that precedes full dark on the prairie, and the cottonwoods along the creek bottom were moving slightly in the first breath of the night air. In the south field, the hogs were settling, their sounds diminishing as the light went. The well pump stood silent. The fence lines ran straight to their corners in every direction, across 380 acres of ground that carried no lien, owed no man a morning. Delia closed her notebook. She set it on the shelf beside Rowena's, beside the ledger, beside the space where Silas Fitch's original farm book had sat, before Rowena had transferred its last entries to her own hand and continued the record forward without interruption. Same time tomorrow? Delia said. Same time, Rowena said. The shed door stayed open as the dark came on, the way it had always stayed open in summer, the way Silas Fitch had left it open on working evenings when the light lasted long enough to use. The canners stood on the stove. The jars stood on the shelves. The tools hung in their places on the rack above the bench, every one of them where a hand reaching without looking would find them, because that was how a shed worked when the person who kept it understood that a tool out of place was a tool that cost time you hadn't budgeted. 3 notebooks on a shelf, 1 pine board, $5.80, and free cucumbers from a works that no longer existed, and a shed that was still standing, and the relish that nobody wanted made by the woman. Nobody thought to ask until the arithmetic grew loud enough that even Creswell County, Nebraska, had to stop what it was doing and listen.